So Ryan, thank you for coming on the podcast, the Food and Philosophy podcast here. I'm glad I got to meet you and see you down in Austin here. So how you doing? One of the things I love about what you're doing is bringing awareness to the Regenaissance movement. That's what you called it, but just the regenerative agriculture and farming movement in general, which is probably one of the biggest factors that's contributing to our like poor health and just I don't know, food system being really bad.
Yeah.
So why did you get into the Regenaissance and like how'd you come up with the name?
So I can't take credit for the name. I wish I was that creative enough to have that. Um, that was actually my friend Case Bradford, because last year we were thinking about doing a podcast together about holistic health and regenerative agriculture, but a lot of other things. And he had the term Regenaissance. But for me, I'm coming from a tech background. I was really disconnected from food my whole life. And it wasn't until pretty much at the start of the pandemic, and then it really accelerated the following year in 2021. Whenever I was my brother's caretaker, he had stage 4 colon cancer. I was his caretaker for the first 6 months of 2021 and watched that unfold and take his life. And then also, my mother was very ill. She was forced to retire from her job because of her health, and this was in 2019. And so yeah, everything was pretty chill in my life up until then, and it changed so rapidly. So the following 6 months after my brother died, I quit my job from tech and essentially just tried to figure out my life. I mean that, yeah, everything was flipped upside down, and so I just started rethinking everything. What do I believe in, and what do I really just want to do with the rest of my life? And so I was on Twitter, and this was around January of last year as well, that I randomly just discovered the term regenerative agriculture because I had never heard of that word until last year. And that was my finally, I guess, light bulb moment after just trying different things to where, oh, that was my light bulb moment in the sense of, oh, I've been so disconnected from my food and health. And growing up, I had the standard American diet. I ate so much garbage, was always really unhealthy, always had gut issues, fatigue. I mean, a lot of the things that are so common in America. And so I just started deep diving into regenerative agriculture. Took this online course with some folks through Twitter, and through that, I found some others that are actually doing ranching themselves. And so I had this huge road trip planned that I did last year. And this was, I think, in June or July of last year. I was in Colorado and I got to get some really good hands on experience on some ranches in Colorado. And I remember the very first meal I had. His name's Jordan Hedberg. All of his beef and then just they had a small garden in the backyard, so all of the produce that they were serving with their meals was all just from their backyard essentially. And when I took that first bite, it was a literally life-changing meal because it just was so different than anything I had been exposed to from the just typical grocery stores. And that made me realize that's exactly where I want to be in agriculture. And so I'm just kind of bouncing around, but fasting forward to September of last year, I had discovered this organization called WOOF, which it's an acronym WWOOF, and that stands for Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. And essentially, it's a global organization. It's pretty awesome. In exchange for housing and food, it's your labor because it's not paid, but it's a great way to get your feet wet and then also obviously have your basic necessities covered. And so this was in just rural Pennsylvania. I had never really experienced rural America at all. I mean, this town was probably 2,500 population, very small. It was in the Amish country, so all the neighbors were essentially Amish. And so that was absolutely incredible. Again, that's the more I was doing all of the farm work, being out in the land, made me realize that's exactly where I wanted to be. But while all this was going on, I had some crazy bad health issues going on myself because I mean the stress and the lack of sleep and not eating at all whenever I was my brother's caretaker really took a toll on my health. I mean, I essentially just sacrificed my health to just do whatever I could to help him. But the doctors, time and time and time and time again, kept failing me. I wasn't getting any answers. And so I was still on this farm last year, but my health kept getting worse and worse, even though I was eating the best food I've ever had, 100% from the farm, which was really interesting because at that time, I remember eating everything and not once craving any junk food. Not a single time. Which again, that's why I want farming and ranching and try to really reconnect us back to all of that. Because if you have that really delicious, nutrient dense food, you can make similar things that you would eat at fast food joints or restaurants. I mean, you can make pizza, ice cream. You can make healthy versions of that just using actual quality ingredients from ranches and farms that do it the right way. But yeah, so I was on this farm. My health kept getting worse. I still was not getting any answers from any of the healthcare that I was trying to have appointments and whatnot. I can't tell you how many thousands of dollars I spent with various tests, and yeah, it still got me nowhere. So I actually had to look to the alternative route of YouTube and Twitter, and then that's whenever I hired Independent, and pretty much in December of last year, his name's Alejandro AD on Twitter. Incredible guy. He had gone through his own hellish journey of health, wrecked gut, and healthcare was failing him. So he just took a deep dive and fixed himself, and now he's helping others. So he had me take a blood test for my thyroid and for a vitamin mineral, just full comprehensive test. Those two tests answered all of my health issues I've had the past essentially now 3 years. Not a single doctor recommended me taking any of these tests, which is just mind boggling. And so I found out I was deficient in quite a few things. Again, just dating back to all that time with my brother and then obviously time after that. And then the more severe thing that I found out that answered really everything was I have Hashimoto's, which is a severe form of hypothyroidism, and explained why no matter how much I'd sleep, I would still not wake up refreshed. Because on the farm, I ended up having to leave early because I wasn't getting any answers. I would just pass out at like 9 p.m., wake up at 5:30, and it felt like I didn't go to sleep at all. I was in an enormous amount of joint pain, and how the farm laid out, there's just two giant hills. So I remember I would have to walk up the hill. By the time I got to the top, it felt like I just ran a mile. And I've ran half marathons. I've always been in solid shape since college. Um, my hair was thinning, really dry skin, really poor memory, brain fog, and the fatigue was the biggest killer. So I finally got all those answers and was really working on that. And so this is January, late January, early February of this year. I had a next farm lined up, which was a bison ranch in Montana. 1 week before that, I was in Idaho, just exploring before going up to Montana. And I had my own health experience to where I ended up in the ER. And I knew the quickest way to get in the gastro, because it was all gastro related, was to come back to Austin. Um, I didn't think it was cancer, but obviously that was in the back of my head because colon cancer is what my brother had, and so I'd seen that obviously firsthand. But had already done the colonoscopies and endoscopies because in 2021 I had two colonoscopies and endoscopies, all clean, not a single polyp, and so yeah, I just had to come back here to just make sure it wasn't cancer and see if they had any answers. So I came back to Austin in February of this year, had that, again, came back clean. I didn't have any polyps. What was really interesting is they said I might have ulcerative colitis, but something as severe as ulcerative colitis or Crohn's, for example, they know right off the bat and diagnose. But for whatever reason, he said I might have colitis or ulcerative colitis, and then to wait a week before they get the full results, and then they called me back and essentially said the same thing. So I'm fairly certain I just have had a really, really inflamed colon and just in crazy dysbiosis from dating back to all my brother's stuff. And then essentially those 3 or 4 months after he died, I was just emotionally eating, and it was all
Mm.
ultra processed garbage. So not only was I in a severely mental stressed environment, lack of sleep, not eating in those 6 months, but after that, I wasn't even refueling with anything that was nutrient dense at all, and just
Mhm.
adding more inflammation. So yeah, whenever I got that news, fortunately, I was obviously happy it wasn't cancer. Um, but that was also still just a huge challenge because I was just in a really bad health spot. And not on top of that, it was just another setback that I've had this last 3 years. So I was in the mindset of, okay, I'm going to recover in Austin in March, April, and then head back to this bison ranch that I was intending to originally go to. And that'd be like around the end of May. Because then also after that bison ranch, I had 3 farms lined up in Italy to where I was going to farm in Sicily, Bologna, and Milan, and then just travel the world and farm and share everything online. And I had plans for YouTube and Substack. I had a lot of things I was going to do with all that. But as I was recovering, I was just going on a walk, and this idea popped into my head about an apparel brand. Because everything I was doing on Twitter and everything that I had plans for in the future of traveling was to just really reconnect us back to our food and talk about the food system. Because whenever I was on that farm in Pennsylvania, I started sharing everything, and I was getting a lot of traction because a lot of people were having the same realization as me, to where, oh shit, I've been so disconnected as well. And then it just really gets the wheels start spinning about the food that they eat and where they're buying it from, going to farmers markets and actually talking to the farmers and ranchers, all of that. I really wanted to really help raise awareness and educate behind all of that. And apparel specifically, I realize, A, we are tribal by nature, and so apparel is a great way to essentially just aid in how humans act. And then B, there's really not a lot of cool looking apparel within the agriculture space. You see farms and ranches have their own brands and whatnot, but outside of that, that's really it. I mean, you have John Deere and Carhartt, but those are more practical things to actually do the farming work. And so I was just doing a lot of research around apparel, and yeah, just saw that opportunity. So I made some quick mock-ups because I didn't have Regenaissance. I initially just had the idea of apparel and having that to just reconnect us. Um, then the idea came to me that, and I remembered that Case had the idea for Regenaissance, and so I reached back out to him and was just like, "Hey man, I know this is not yours, but you're the one that came up with the word. I've got this idea for apparel brand. Can I use Regenaissance?" He's like, "Yeah." So Regenaissance takes 2 words, regenerative and renaissance. So I know you mentioned regenerative agriculture, which is becoming much more mainstream, especially compared to whenever I first heard it last January. But then also, our bodies are just really resilient and can essentially regenerate within. But then Renaissance, Liver King just exploded on the scene with his liver, and then that just turned into organ blends and organ meats, and then just a full nose to tail. But not just that, bone marrow is becoming a much bigger thing again, using tallow. And then the biggest thing I've noticed too is bone broth. 2 years ago, if you went to stores, there'd probably be like one bone broth you could buy, and now stores are just stocked with all kinds of bone broth brands. And so that's made me realize it's just kind of a new renaissance of just going back to how we used to eat. And not on top of that, the logo of the Regenaissance is the bison, as you can see. That's the shirt behind me. I was very intentional about that too because they almost went extinct. And if you think about the 1800s, whenever we had the best farmland in the world, bison were a huge part of that. And people are starting to wake up and have the same type of feelings that I have towards bison. They're just such majestic animals. They're they're pretty much the apex of the food chain and are incredible at regenerating our land. And then they're also incredible for us. So I see this resurgence of really taking care of the bison. There's more and more bison ranches being propped up. And so, yeah, I just think that's just the new Renaissance era of everything with that. Um, yeah, I'll just leave it at that for now. And then that's just the huge idea of Regenaissance is continuing to just raise awareness around agriculture and how we've gotten here because originally it was just apparel. I've recently started my own Regenaissance podcast talking to farmers and ranchers and others in the agriculture space because there's so much that goes into Um, just that whole entire space. I mean, when you think about you have your plate of food and you really don't think about everything that goes into that. And so, yeah, I really want to help paint that full picture. And yeah, just as that way of just really bridging that gap because we're the most disconnected we've ever been from our food, which is wild considering that's the thing that keeps us alive and advance in society.
Yeah, I think the main thing about your story that's so, I guess, like crazy, but then it's really like a common occurrence for everyone is just the connection between like the food and the medical system, where basically we get to a point where we're eating such bad food and that's just so normal that we end up getting sick and then getting thrust into the medical system, which is not even helping us whatsoever.
Hmm.
So I feel like it's unfortunate that it happens, but it happens to so many people nowadays that it's like just worth bringing to like the light that you can like kind of choose a different perspective, which is to try to source your meat from these places that are actually treating their animals the right way and getting this like nutrient dense food that actually does taste good. But I'm curious as far as your connection, like when you were going to the farms, did the farmers and ranchers that you were speaking to have anything that they recommended to the average consumer that they should be doing to like push for this new movement, or were they just saying to like purchase their own meat?
The biggest thing is just where your dollars go because that's the best way to influence the whole entire system. If you start taking your dollars out of essentially all of the conventional industrial, I mean, the system's so complex, but the biggest thing is just going directly to the farmers and ranchers, going to farmers markets and giving them your dollars rather than purchasing just these huge conglomerates like Tyson Foods or Smithfield Foods. I know it's not
Hmm.
always possible for people depending
Yeah.
on where you live, but the biggest thing is absolutely just your purchasing and where you're getting that from. But then also just talking with friends and family as well. Because I hear the same stories over and over again once they found a good local rancher and farmer and bought directly from them. They just rave about how much better the food tastes. And that can only get that can only expand if you actually yourself are putting in the work and actually buying from them and sharing all that info out. Because
Hmm.
if those two things don't happen, then um, our system will just only be more centralized, and all the small farms will just be swiped essentially.
Yeah.
Because that's already happening to where all the small family farms are getting smaller and smaller, and all the bigger ones are getting bigger and bigger.
Since you started Twitter and your apparel brand, there's been like such a outpouring of support for people just posting about your content and I guess posting about like wearing your stuff. So I'm just curious to know like how that feels for you to feel like you actually are contributing to something and to have kind of like a nice ecosystem on Twitter of people supporting your brand and repping it and posting about it.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. That I don't think that feeling will ever get old. Especially whenever I see others sharing their own stuff on social media, whether it be videos or pictures, and I just see them wearing my shirts or hats. I mean, it's pretty cool. And then
Yeah.
more specifically, I will never forget this message. Um, this was shortly after I launched. I got a message from someone saying that their house burned down. I think it was like 6 months previous, and they lost everything. And my shirts were the first thing they intentionally bought, and that was wild to read.
That's so
So yeah,
powerful.
that feeling will never get old, and it means the world. And that's literally what fuels me every day.
As far as you're going to farms and like serving for them, you said that you were thinking about going to Italy. Is there any sort of practices they do over there that's different than the United States, if you know? And if their system is just as bad as ours, or if they have more support for smaller farms and local people?
Yeah, it's definitely different because it's hard to compare America to the rest of the world just because of how large America is like the size of the country. Because Italy's really small, so their farms you can't have a 100,000 acre ranch or farm like you could here. So theirs are much smaller scale, one big thing that they don't really do um, is use a lot of chemical sprays like we do here. So Roundup is banned.
Mm.
They they're much more local too. That's a huge thing. Is they just use their local foods. Here we ship everything around, and that can change the actual environment whenever you're not using native plants or species. Because that actually causes can cause a lot of issues to the land whenever you bring in non-native species, because then they just turn invasive. Outside of that, I'm not too sure. That was actually part of why I wanted to do this traveling, was to see the similarities and differences, especially because with agriculture, it's really dependent upon your land and the local weather.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, outside of that, I'm not too sure.
One of the things I've heard from people that are not purchasing regenerative meat or grass-fed meat that are my friends, they're kind of having difficulty finding grass-fed meat because they go to the supermarket and they just kind of don't know exactly what they should be buying. So obviously, like we would recommend just to go directly to the farm. But do you have any experience or know of anything about directly like grass-fed meat and whether like the supermarket grass-fed meat is really what it says it is, or if it is even comparable at all to what you would get at a local farm?
I mean, that's the biggest thing about why you should go talk to farms and ranches, because it's pretty much impossible to really verify it without doing that, especially if you go to grocery stores. Another thing you can do too that I highly, highly recommend, because you can still buy grass fed, grass finished, high quality regenerative meat from just places online, and they'll ship directly to your door. And that's also, if you think long term, that if you have the space, buying a chest freezer and just buying a quarter, half, or however much you can fit of a cow is huge. And not only will, I mean, that's the best way to verify that, is you can have those conversations on the phone with them. Um, I mean, if it's kind of close by, you can go visit and see the operation for yourself. But buying stuff from the grocery store is just, there's good stuff, but it's really hard to fully verify the legitimacy of it all. Because also,
That's true.
labeling laws really don't exist now. So you can have meat that's labeled American meat, but is actually imported from New Zealand or Brazil or otherwhere around the world, and then they process it in America, and then they're able to just label it as made in
Hmm.
America. And so that's another reason why I say you should actually go visit your farmers and ranchers, because essentially labeling doesn't mean shit anymore. I mean, even with organic produce in stores, you can't really verify it. And there's also, organic does not mean it's not been sprayed with chemicals. And so,
Mm.
yeah, it's a huge, huge cluster to say,
Yeah.
to put it lightly.
Have you, or how exactly have you made relationships with the farmers? Like, what's been the best way for you to get those relationships and potentially go buy meat from them? Because sometimes I feel like I would be inclined to go meet them, but I just don't know exactly where I should go, besides just like a farmer's market or just trying to search them up online. But I'm sure you might have some tactics.
Yeah, I mean, they're really friendly. And so you can just call them up or send them an email saying you're interested, because again, we are so disconnected to where most of these people are not used to having a huge influx of interested people. And so, yeah, just call them up and just tell them, hey, it could be something as simple as, I have realized my whole life I've never really talked to farmers or ranches. I've never really visited them. I've been starting to really think about where I'm getting my food and my health. And yeah, I mean, just something as simple as that, and then just say, I have questions for you, or I would love to come out and visit. More often than not, they would love to have you. And if they're not, then that's usually a sign that you shouldn't even be buying from them in the first place. Um, Especially if they don't really want you visiting, because most people that are farmers and ranchers would love to have you there, because they love to talk about everything they're doing. But then also that's just helping verify that they're legit and just
Mm.
adds more customers to them. I think we really just overthink um, Yeah, I think we just really overthink something like this because it really is that simple as just saying hello to them and saying you're just wanting to learn more and you're just curious about your food and your health and where it's coming from. And that will open the door immediately.
I think one of the points you're getting at too is just the relationship with our health that we kind of need to change, which is just taking it into our own hands versus just going to the store and hoping that they're going to have certain products, maybe go out of your way to the farm directly where the food's actually being made. And then the same thing could probably be said for like your doctor. Like you said, you went out to like find your own doctor on Twitter who might actually know a little bit more and not just prescribe you some sort of medication that's not actually treating the root cause, but rather just your symptoms. So I think everything kind of like ties back to just like kind of what you're putting in your body though originally, because if from a young age you're starting with actual good food, it's you're probably never going to get to the point where you're going to need all these pharmaceutical drugs that they're trying to sell you. So just a tangent there, but um, I'm just curious about like your relationship now with your health. Like, have you been able to improve it since you started working with the person on their own? And like, if so, um, what would you recommend to someone who might be like kind of like deeply entrenched in the medical system? And be, like, how could you tell them like maybe like they might need to look into their own alternative options, I guess?
So for that second part, I would recommend them just reflecting on those conversations that they've had with doctors and their recommendations and the things that they might not be asking. So one thing that I've always like, for example, not a single doctor recommended me taking a vitamin and mineral blood panel, which is wild now that I've thought about that now because that's so important and that can answer so many questions. And then I think about they never really talk about my nutrition or I mean they would ask questions about my stress and whatnot because of my personal situation,
Yeah.
but that should be the first thing that you really start thinking about is the actual conversations that you've had with these folks. Um, yeah, you just I would
Well,
really advise
it's
that.
part of it's like
Okay.
they give you like 5 to 8 minutes for
Yeah.
them. Like they don't have enough time to actually get to know you.
No. And that's critical. And not only that, you should think about the information that they provide in their recommendations, why they're doing that. Why are they recommending this drug that has all these side effects? Why are they not trying to tackle the root cause? Why are they giving you all these band-aids? I would definitely start there. But for me, my health, with Hashimoto's, I would say I've improved slightly. The biggest thing for me has been stress management. So I know I've not really mentioned it, but so my launch date of my brand was May 20th this year. My mom's health I mentioned was really bad, and that was progressively getting worse and worse. She actually died on the same day that my brand launched. So even though I was getting better somewhat mentally, and I was starting my own business, my personal life was still hell. And so that weighed heavily on my mind. And with all of that, my health was pretty shit. Um, and then after my mom died, I had an awful housing situation. I live in Texas, so the heat is pretty bad. The insulation was really bad in my apartment to where it'd be 80 degrees every day until about 2 a.m. So I wasn't sleeping. And so it wasn't until essentially this month. So now it's almost been 3 years, but it wasn't until this month where I'm starting to finally slowly improve. But that's because I've finally been able to manage my stress better. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, because it just was never ending for 2.5 years. But I have the foundation in place and I know what I need to eat. I know to get a lot of sunlight and grounding. And so it's now just following the system that I have in place for myself and just being patient. Because that
Yeah.
was also another thing that it's really hard to be patient in my case. I have been very active, but I can't do sports. I can't lift weights. I can't run. I can't really go hiking. I can't climb because of Hashimoto's right now. Um, but I am walking a lot. So it's just really trying to focus in on the things that I can do
Mhm.
and focusing on my business and social life. And then it'll eventually heal itself naturally.
It's good that you finally got it and like you know what you need to do, which is probably the most empowering thing for people is to finally feel like they actually have control over their health and know that what they're being told is not just something that uh, may not work and just kind of the general advice versus anything tailored specifically to you. I'm curious as far as your podcast is concerned, like since you started doing it, have you learned anything about yourself or just the industry in general about anything related to regenerative ag? Anything new that you've taken from the first few episodes that you've done?
So I've had some really interesting conversations. I had one a couple weeks ago with his name's Dax Hansen. Dax Hansen. He's in Arizona. It's called Oatman Farms. He
Mm.
does wheat, and so it was just interesting talking to him. I mean, on the topic of whenever you mention Italy, there's so many people that always talk about how they went to Italy and they could eat all the bread and pasta in the world and they felt great, versus coming back here and obviously feeling like complete shit. And so it was interesting talking to him about just all of the issues with gluten in America and why we have all these issues. And he was mentioning actually about the native species and all of the GMO crap that we've got now in America, paired with just the terrible quality of soil and all the sprays. It makes sense why all of our wheat is so bad and wreaks havoc on our gut because it's just so unnatural. And so he's doing it the right way. It was interesting just hearing him how their process of making their wheat. And so that was episode 5. Another one was episode 4 I had with AJ Ritzers, and that was just interesting talking on the food system and the supply chain because it is so complex but also so fragile to where I don't know if you see in Acapulco right now where they had that crazy bad hurricane and their supply chain is just wrecked and now it's just madness down there to where people are killing each other just once you go back to the bare necessities of needing food, society collapses really quickly. And so it was just interesting talking to him about what he's trying to do to help fix that
Mm.
and help alleviate that problem because processing, for example, is such a huge bottleneck. So that Jordan Hedberg, the ranch I visited last June, we went to the processing facility and he was scheduling some processing of a couple of his cattle, and it was scheduled for I don't know if it was September or October of this year. So you had to plan so far ahead in advance, and that's such a difficult thing to place on the farmers because there's so many variables that it's really hard to plan that far ahead and thinking that cattle would be good to go by then. Um, so those two things specifically were really great. And then yesterday I had a conversation on bees and honey with he's the
Mm.
president of the American Honey Producers Association. And so it was interesting just hearing him talk about I think he said in 2021 or last year we had lost 40 or 45% of our bee population, which was pretty wild. And he was just mentioning from diseases and whatnot. But then hearing him talk about also just the battles that they have to face too. Um, because I know with raw honey wanting to have it pesticide free, there's a lot of different mites and viruses that they have to continue to fight, and so their whole world is really complex. And so that's why I have this podcast. I don't Regenerative agriculture is amazing, and I'm a huge proponent of it. But there's been this huge, and I've definitely fallen part to this too, and so I'm definitely guilty of this. I'm not saying I've never done this, but we have demonized all of conventional ag, and that's just going to alienate because a lot of these farmers have been doing this their whole lives. They were born and raised in agriculture, fourth, fifth, sixth generational farmers. So going back to the 1800s, and now they're just being told that they are just these idiots that are destroying our world, producing awful food. Um, and so yeah, that's the whole point of the podcast is really painting the picture of everything that goes into agriculture, but also hearing their stories. because they don't have a voice at all. There's this new documentary that came out called Common Ground. Excuse my language, is fucking terrible, and it pisses me off that that was one of the huge documentaries going on for regenerative agriculture because it's just greenwashing. It was just celebrities. I mean, Woody Harrelson, Jason Momoa, Childish Gambino. Why the hell are they doing this stuff whenever it was just really frustrating? It was very hollow documentary. They had Gabe Brown, which he's an incredible, incredible voice in the space. But it's just where are all these other farmers and ranchers that had been doing this their whole lives too? There's no one really doing any type of documentaries for those folks. And so, yeah, it was just a lot of virtue signaling. There's a lot of virtue signaling and greenwashing going on for regenerative agriculture, and that's why I have this
Hmm.
podcast. Um, because you can go there and I'll have these real conversations. I'm just asking questions for them. I'm just want to hear what they have to say because there's some podcasts doing that, but overall, social media is just greenwashing, and it's really frustrating.
Hmm. I never really thought about that point about just like the bees and the wheat, because it's like it's not just the meat that's being made that's the problem. It's like all these other facets from GMOs to the glyphosate being sprayed. So I feel like there's like a huge overhaul that needs to take place, but it's a little bit hard, like you said, to get these farmers who've done it for so long um, to then want to change. So I think it kind of just starts with the consumer asking for a different product, and then eventually these farmers would kind of do it out of like business pursuit, because they would say like, hey, like these people are actually buying a better product, so that's why I would want to change it. So I think
Let
that's
me give
really
you. I'll give you
interesting.
an example because there's a lot of trade-offs with everything. So when thinking of chemical sprays and trying to just yeah, with all the chemical sprays within, say, produce, for example, whenever you just have so many acres that you've got to cover and harvest, they'll make the trade-off of having these sprays because of labor, for example. So the farm I was on, we were all hand-picking everything, and they had strawberries. And essentially, one out of every 10 strawberries I could pick, I could sell because the rest were just getting eaten up by bugs and whatnot. That's why they use sprays. And so labor is really difficult for farming, and finding actual labor, people that will actually help and work and actually do the tough work because it is extremely tough work. I mean, it's very labor intensive. It doesn't matter what the weather's like, you're going to have to go out there. And so, not only are less and less people helping and getting into agriculture, but then inflation's happening. So, when we think about pricing, we see this more expensive produce and meat, and you're not going to buy that because why would you? That's what a lot of people's mindsets thinking of. And so there's just these huge challenges with that because people aren't really aware of the fact that if you want to do it the right way and not use these huge tractors and plowing the land and using sprays, you're gonna have to need more people to help you out, and it's gonna be more manual intensive. And so most people aren't aware of that. And again, that's why I go back to greenwashing and the virtue signaling because it's all these people just giving their inputs and thinking they're right, and then just saying they're all these farmers are wrong. Yet they've never stepped foot on a farm. They've never worked an hour in their life on a farm, and so that's again why I have that podcast because I could rant for the rest of the night about just so many examples like that within the space that I've realized because I've only been in the space for a year, and
Mhm.
I might know some things, but I don't know shit compared to these farmers that have been in it their whole lives and have worked with others in the space their whole lives.
Yeah. Do you think that would be the number one thing you've changed on your perspective since you started talking with these farmers directly, would just be like kind of the perspective that conventional ranching might not be, like it's more so portrayed as something worse than it is? Would that be the thing that you think have changed so far for you, or anything else?
Yeah, I would say so. It's just so complex, man. I mean, there's a lot of conventional farmers to where I would never want to talk to at all and interact with, but there are just as many, if not more, incredible, incredible folks in the conventional side of things. Um, it's very hard to make a living. Very, very
Yeah.
hard, especially if you're not one of the big players. And so having to transition to regenerative after being conventional is very time intensive, labor intensive, and it's very expensive. And not only that, you have to rethink how you strategize essentially after doing it for, say, 30 years. Because the average age of the farmer is around 55, 60 years old. And so that's also why I'm glad I've changed a little bit because, again, we go back to this demonizing and saying that they're evil. So, how are you going to help shift their perspective about regenerative agriculture when you're just telling them they're wrong and evil and destroying the world? I'm very against that. So, I would say that's definitely shifted my perspective a little bit to just show more compassion
Hmm.
and also take a back seat because people are just giving their answers without understanding anything about agriculture and they're just virtue signaling.
Yeah. You've got this hat that I'm wearing now, the make milk raw again hat. So I'm wondering how you came up with that and kind of just your opinion about the current state of milk.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I didn't have raw milk until last year. I was in the same boat of thinking it should always be illegal and that we should only be drinking pasteurized. That's just because I was what I was told. And then I started learning about how raw milk is so amazing for us. It cures so many ailments. Pasteurizing denatures a lot of the beneficial bacteria and enzymes within raw milk. Um, so yeah, I just wanted that's part of the raising awareness. So one of the shirts I had at the start of my brand was Raw is Law, and I was just talking about raw milk, trying to make a cool, catchy slogan. Whenever I was thinking about hats, Raw is Law, and I had it as like a milk bottle. That wouldn't look good at hats, so I was thinking, okay, what else could be for that? And then I forgot um, the Make America Great Again. I've seen Make Milk Great Again or Make Raw Milk Great
Yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
but I just wanted to make a little twist to that. So Make Milk Raw Again just seemed to really work. And so I had my graphic designer just quickly whip that up, and I liked how it turned out. So I went with that, and again, it just adds on to trying to raise awareness because I do get a lot of looks and funny looks, and then also some positive comments about wearing the hat. So it's just really just trying to open people's eyes up and start those conversations in real life.
Hmm. I know there's been this kind of circulating thought around with multiple people that I've talked to about in the regenerative space, just about the idea of like having multiple people all living together and I mean not necessarily in the same house, but in the same neighborhood or on the same kind of farm or something like that. And they would all like share um, the meat and the produce all from this one community. So I was wondering if you had thought of that as well, and if you think that could potentially be a future for the U.S. where there's kind of like communities that would all like live off of like one local farmer, opposed to the store model we have now.
Uh-oh. Oh, okay. You there?
We're
Sorry,
back.
it froze. It froze
Yeah.
for like 30 seconds. If you can repeat that.
Okay. So yeah. So basically, a lot of people have had this idea. Um, kind of came to me and then I mentioned it like out loud and I heard other people had the same idea. So I was wondering if you had it too. Where basically instead of going to the supermarket to get food, you would live either near a farm or like kind of on a farm or something like that in a small community, maybe with 40 or 100 people, like how a tribe used to be. And you would all share the food. All the food would be made locally, opposed to going to the store and buying that. So I was kind of curious if you had that, heard of that or had that same thought, and if you think that is actually something that we could possibly do in the U.S. Just
I've
your
definitely
opinion.
heard of it myself. So I want to have a ranch long term, and so I would want to have a ranch hand and um, potentially two ranch hands essentially. And so I would have three houses, and it'd be more community, but I wouldn't want to get to that big of where you're at because it's an interesting conversation. I've realized even just dating back to whenever I was sharing everything on Twitter in September, people really fantasize about getting off the grid and living in rural areas without fully experiencing it ever in their lives. And so I'd recommend doing that first before because yeah, it's very easy to fantasize. A lot of people fantasize about farming and ranching as well. And I've talked to so many farmers and ranchers to where they have people that are so gung ho, they've want to do all this, and they come to the farm and they quickly realize, oh, there's so much work they've got to be doing, and they don't last very long. And I know I've heard so many stories like that, and so I definitely have my reservations about that because it's always one of those examples of it sounds better in theory, but it could
Hmm.
definitely work if you have dedicated ranchers and farmers and you have people that are really about supporting those folks and wanting that nutrient dense food and being out in nature because you are way more connected to the environment and the natural world than say me and you because we're in Texas or we're in a bigger city right now. So yeah, it just really depends on the people and if they've actually whether they've lived on a farm or been in a really rural remote area. I would recommend doing that first before thinking about actually making that leap without ever experiencing it firsthand.
It's a very fair point because a lot of the luxuries we take, even though they might not be thought of, just like being able to go to the store and get literally anything you want. As much as I was talking crap about the supermarket, it's like that is definitely one thing that I was just in Costa Rica and I don't know, just being off the grid. Sometimes like you got bad service, you need to actually go to a store to get Wi-Fi, and then not being able to have the luxuries of just like shipping whatever products you want, arriving in 2 or 3 days is just a huge difference. Um,
Yeah,
but
I mean that's a
yeah,
good point because I mean there's Starlink, but for example, the farm I had in Pennsylvania, they didn't have Wi-Fi, and so that's it took a while to adjust for sure. After being so used to having Wi-Fi my whole life, um, it was a huge shift.
yeah. What do you think you have in store for the Regenaissance? Do you think it's mostly going to stay with apparel, or do you think the future you might? I mean, obviously you have the podcast now, but do you think it's for product wise, it's going to be mostly apparel?
Yeah, definitely apparel, and then still just heavy on just videos. And next year, I want to get back on the road and start visiting more ranches and farms. And uh, like AJ Richards, he's in Utah and he has his own processing facility that should be up and running next year. So I'm gonna go visit him and just really getting my name out there to talk to more and more people in the space. I don't know about conferences, but yeah, really focusing on more apparel because I've stopped with new releases for a while, but next year I plan to re-pick that up. And I mean, I know it's fall and heading into winter. Next year I'll have a huge fall and winter line with sweatshirts and sweatpants, long sleeve, beanies. I mean, yeah, there's a lot I still have in store. I want to do for all of that.
Yeah. All right, that's most of the questions I had for you, Ryan. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. What's the best way people can get in touch with you, whether it be Twitter, podcast, or whatever? How should they get in touch?
Yeah. So my website is theregenaissance.co, and I believe the handles on Twitter and Instagram are both the Regenaissance or some form of that. It should be fairly easy to find, I would hope.
Yeah.
And then my personal Instagram and Twitter are just Regenaissance Man. And then I think outside of that, I'm good. Thanks for having me,
Sweet,
man.
man. Well, hopefully some people can buy some shirts. They are 100% cotton, by the way. So if you're wearing the shorts or the shirt, you're not getting any of the polyester on you. So that's
Oh
another
yeah.
reason to buy them and support Ryan. But yeah, peace.